Hi, everyone. Welcome to RNS Virtual Events. I'm RNS Events host Nyla Boodoo. Thank you so much for being here with us today. If you're like me in DC, we are still digging out from the snow and we're experiencing temperatures more like Minnesota than DC. As always, we love to hear in the chat where you're joining us from. So feel free to put in the chat where you're joining us. Thank you so much for coming to this breaking news virtual event. We appreciate you joining us on short notice. Today, we are going to be going on the ground to Minneapolis-St. Paul to speak with faith leaders there about the response to the federal ICE operation. So this is actually in addition to our regularly scheduled virtual events. If you get our morning newsletter, the morning report, we share all of our virtual events there. We will put a link in the chat for you to sign up. And if you're not familiar with RNS, we're a nonprofit newsroom that has for more than 9 decades been covering the world of religion. We like to say that religion is always in the room, and that's certainly been the case in Minnesota as we have been documenting the faith-based response to federal ICE operations that included now, unfortunately, the killings of Renee Good and now Alex Preety. Jack Jenkins, who's joining us today, is back in DC. He has been in and out of Minneapolis for the past month. We're going to be hearing from him. We are also grateful to 2 local faith leaders for taking time out of their very busy schedules to be joining us today. Imam Mowlid Ali from Abubakar Mosque in southern Minneapolis. Joining us in just a few minutes, Reverend Ingrid Rasmussen with Holy Trinity Lutheran is also going to be joining us. She was actually, we'll talk about where she's been, but there's been some events that she's been involved with for the morning. So we're hoping she's going to join us in just a few minutes. And just sort of how our schedule is going to go today. I will be speaking with them for most of the hour, but we want to leave time for questions from you all as well. So please make sure when we get to that portion to use the Q&A function in the chat for your questions, and our RNS producers will be monitoring that, and we'll get to as many of your questions as we can. We want to thank the Henry Luce Foundation for their generous support, which has made this event possible and has funded so much of the important immigration journalism that RNS is doing. And if you have not noticed, I do want to note that this event is being recorded. We will be mailing out a copy of this recording, a link to it tomorrow. We know that lots of people maybe weren't able to make it, but please feel free to share this with others who couldn't be here. We are very grateful for you and for our guests for making time and for the support that you have for our journalism. I just want to remind our audience that we have a zero tolerance policy at our events for abusive language. So please keep your comments civil and on topic with today's discussion. Zero tolerance means that people who are abusive or who are off topic will be removed from the chat. We do not expect that will happen today because we are here for a lively conversation. And can I make a suggestion? I personally find multitasking very difficult. So I would suggest being present and focusing on what our guests are saying rather than the chat. But let me formally introduce our guests. Imam Mowlid Ali is with Abubakar As-saddique Islamic Center in Minneapolis, Minnesota. He's also the director of the Abubakar Islamic Institute for Youth and Leadership. Imam, thank you for being with us. We also have Reverend Ingrid Rasmussen with us, pastor of Holy Trinity Lutheran, also in South Minneapolis. The wonderful Elsa Owen, who's one of our RNS staff, who's from Minneapolis and still lives in the area, told me to say that Holy Trinity and Abubakar are separated by Hiawatha. So for those of you who know, you know the region. And I want to thank RNS and welcome RNS National Reporter Jack Jenkins as well for joining us. Hi, guys. Everybody, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Hello, hello.
And Reverend Ingrid and Imam, you can unmute yourselves as well if you want. You know, there is just so much news and events that have been happening so fast. We started planning this actually over the weekend before Alex Preety's killing. I know we have news, especially here in DC last night, about changes to leadership of the ICE operation in your city and the news that some federal agents appear to be leaving. I want to get to all of that. But first, can I just start by asking how you are? Imam Ali, can I start with you? How are you? It looks like you're still on mute. There we go.
Sorry about that. Yeah.
That's okay.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, everyone. It's still morning for us in Minneapolis. So, good morning to everyone. We're doing okay. I'm okay. I mean, the city is in crisis, but my neighborhood is in crisis, but we have faith in God.
Thank you for sharing that, Imam. Uh, Reverend Ingrid?
Yeah, I have said in these last several weeks and in the months prior to that, since federal forces started occupying Minneapolis, that a lot of us feel like our hearts are kind of living up in our throats on any given day. And I think um, there's this strange mix of devastation and courage that arises in the midst of moral crisis. And I think that's what we're experiencing in the city, both in our bodies and on the streets.
Jack, what's it been like for you? Because you've been going back and forth between here in DC and Minneapolis. What would you say, what's it been like for you to cover all of this over the past month or so?
Yeah, it's been fascinating. I'll note I've been doing some reporting on various different religious responses to this kind of influx of DHS and ICE agents in different cities across the country. And with my colleague Aleha here at RNS, we've been covering stuff out in LA, and I was actually in Chicago in the fall. And so it's been fascinating to watch how there have been faith leaders involved from the jump, including starting in LA, with pushback to DHS and federal agents in terms of how they're conducting this mass deportation policy. And it just kind of built on each other. We've seen different faith leaders learn from faith leaders in other cities about how they were responding. And then by the time I got to Minneapolis, I mean, I don't have to tell the folks there, the response was so robust, right? You know, when I was driving around, I had driven around with some folks who were spotting ICE in Chicago, and that was intense enough. By the time I got to Minneapolis and was driving around, you couldn't miss ICE, right? They was just they were everywhere, and so too were the people who were responding to them. You know, in this one neighborhood that I was patrolling with a faith leader, the which is the same neighborhood where Renee Good was killed, virtually every corner had someone on it with a whistle, who was keeping an eye out for ICE agents, some of them with binoculars. So I hadn't ever seen that at that level. It's one of the most robust responses to anything that I've seen in a while in terms of mass organizing, and that also includes religious communities. This is one of the largest surges of faith-based organizing I've seen in years, if in my career.
Imam, Jack is talking about your neighborhood. Your mosque is quite close to where Renee Good was killed. Can we back up and can we go to how things started changing? Maybe not even, I imagine, from the beginning of the ICE operation, but even before that, can you just share how things have been especially difficult for the Somali American community that is most of your congregation? I think you're on mute again. You can
Oh,
stay unmuted if you want. Yeah,
I'm sorry.
that's okay.
Yeah. So before the killing of Renee Good and Alex, and before this whole tragedies and crisis, I mean, I think the beginning was when the president called my community garbage and started dehumanizing an entire population. And then from there, we started having like concerns and fear about like what's gonna happen. This is going to be the end, or this is gonna affect all of us. We were hoping that, the president's words would stay words, but now we see that, it turned into ICE operation, not only affecting the Somali Americans, but affecting all of us. So, I mean, for us, it's a tragedy. And today we're speaking as one Minnesotans, not only as Somali Americans, but we're one. We're one today. Today I mean, the president said garbage, but that was just a word. Now people have been killed. We have like Renee Good was a good mother. She was my neighbor. Alex likewise was my neighbor. And we're dealing with government, killing American citizens. We're talking about, lack of safety. We're talking about like, lack of peace. We're talking about like our children. So they're living in fear. Like, if you live in Minneapolis and you're a parent, you know how that feels. No school, everything in Zoom. children are afraid to go outside, right? I mean, we're living in that kind of situation, and it's not normal. This is not normal for us, and it's not actually. This is not a Minnesota culture. We're united communities. This is something that came from outside, and it's extraneous to our culture as Minnesotans. So, I mean, we're as a faith leader. When Renee was killed, I went to the neighborhood. I spoke. I gave a speech, and I demanded justice for Renee Good because she demands justice. Yesterday, we went to actually on Saturday, we went to another neighborhood in St. Paul, remembering Alex and coming together as loving your neighbors. I gave a speech in a church, and same thing. We went there to show up. I think that's what's needed now. Just show up and show some love, and also to do some actions and help the needy and those who are like cannot come outside. There are families that cannot come outside. They don't have food. Some of them cannot even pay rent due to all of this chaos and crisis. So, I mean, that's where we are right now. But of course, it's we're outraged. But at the same time, as a faith leader, I tell my community that we have to respond with wisdom, not panic. We have to respond with courage, not fear, and we have to stay grounded in faith, because with the love of the people that are showing us, the neighbors. I mean, you look at before Alex was killed. Look at what happened in U.S. Bank Stadium, the Target Center, and the entire Minneapolis. 50,000 people came out to show unity. I mean, that's who we are. I mean, that's the Minnesota culture, and I appreciate, all the faith leaders, including, Reverend Ingrid and everyone else who is on the ground, supporting and giving, speech and helping the neighbors. So I'm optimistic. I mean, I know this is
Thank you for
not
that.
always
Yeah,
easy.
Imam, thank you for sharing so much of that detail. I think that's so helpful for people. And Reverend Ingrid, can I just ask you, as the Imam was saying, I know just in the time we've been trying to put this event together and I've been talking to you, I've gotten to a little bit to know how busy your life has been. I know you were yesterday at the Whipple Federal Center. You were just at an event this morning with Senator Raphael Warnock. Can you share a little bit about the on the ground work you're doing and how this response has changed your day-to-day pastoral life, if there was kind of a typical one before this?
Yeah, I think our first major federal raid on Lake Street, this really immigrant-rich corridor that I serve alongside, our first federal raid of magnitude was back in June of 2025. And so we have been sort of preparing in earnest for this moment since then. I think what we are seeing play out, as the Imam described, is families living in fear and living in hiding. We see businesses that have worked so hard to recover since 2020 and the fires that engulfed the city after the police murder of George Floyd. We've seen those businesses really struggling. So part of what we've been doing as a church is paying rents, January rents for immigrant-owned businesses along the corridor so that we don't lose our sort of economic center of the community, of the cultural corridor. That has meant that our pastor's discretionary account, which is quite large because of the nature of our work, we spent an entire year's budget in the first 14 days of 2026. So that just gives you a sense of the magnitude of need that we're experiencing in the neighborhood right now. It means accompanying people who have been unlawfully detained. So we're hiring attorneys as fast as we can to do habeas petitions before detainees can be moved across state lines, because it becomes much harder when they get to Texas for us to do that as Minnesotans. It means that yesterday, I mean, here's a joy story in the midst of all of that. It means that we got to pick up somebody who from the Whipple building who had been unlawfully detained and bring him home to his family. So there are those moments of like sheer joy in the midst of all of the terror. Um, I told my congregation on Sunday that through tears, what we're trying to do is determine how we keep those rhythms, those rituals that we depend on for our very life going in the midst of federal occupation, because we know those are important. And then we're also trying to determine what areas of congregational life and community life we can let go so that we can attend to the moral crisis that we find ourselves in. So, yeah, I would say the work is never ending, and bless my husband's heart because I really haven't seen my kids much in the last 3 weeks either.
Mm, mm. Um, I see you can keep putting questions in the Q&A and we'll get to some of them, especially if they're those that are relevant to the conversation, I'll bring in immediately. Can I just ask, and Jack, I wonder if you can help to start answer this question. And Imam and Reverend, if you can weigh in too. Thomas was just asking, is the scene like an occupying quasi-military force being present? Is ICE visibly present on the street? Jack, can you start with what you've seen, and then everyone else, can you weigh in too, please?
Yeah, and I'll defer to them in terms of the most recent developments, right? Because now you have the National Guard, and then But I will say what was really astonishing when I went there is that, like, compared to Chicago, right, where there was already a significant influx of ICE agents, where you would, when I was with groups who were looking for them, you would run into them. Who were looking for them. You didn't really have to look in Minneapolis. And I think part of that's a volume reality, right? 3 to 4
Right,
thousand
3,000,
agents,
right. Mm-hmm.
descending on one city that is not as large as Chicago or New York or LA. Like, there's just like raw dynamic there. And so the result is that, you couldn't avoid seeing them. I like the last time I was there for the faith convening, about 600 plus faith leaders that came into the city to kind of be trained on how to resist and push back against ICE in their own communities. They deployed those faith leaders to different areas of the city, about 200 of them, to kind of do some of that observing of ICE activities. And I was just standing there interviewing a couple of them on the side of the road, and in the middle of the interview, an unmarked car with two unclearly identifiable federal agents sitting in the front just drove by. And I defer to those who are living there. That's not an uncommon sight in a lot of these neighborhoods. And so, it doesn't necessarily always look like a bunch of militarized vehicles. But it does. If you're not if you're keeping an eye out, you can see folks driving by, and you can also hear the whistles all the time of community members coming out of their homes or following suspected ICE vehicles, trying to alert the community of their presence. It was just, throughout my time reporting in Minneapolis, it was constant.
Imam, Reverend, you go ahead, Reverend. You.
Yeah, I would say that I have been unable to make it to the church without ending up in the middle of a convoy. So the
How
intent,
far is that from your home to church?
not
How
very
far
far.
are you?
It's about
Okay.
a mile and a half.
Okay.
And so the intensity of the experience in South Minneapolis is really remarkable. One morning, it was last week, I suppose. Time is all relative under federal occupation, so take my days as with a grain of salt. But one day last week, I had just left home. I was already getting messages that ICE was staging at the commercial area that's just right across the street from the congregation that I serve. And so I was on my way to sort of see what was unfolding there. The staging is not unusual. It happens almost every morning. But on my way there, I came to a four-way stop. I realized that I was in the middle of a convoy, an ICE convoy. And we were right by the middle school. I mean, we were right by our neighborhood middle school, and it was drop-off time. There are parents sending their kids out of their car doors. And this was, days after Renee Good had been killed. So I started to beep to warn the parents, especially who were there beside me. And before I knew it, another car from the convoy had come around to box me in. And I kept beeping, and other people started beeping, and there's whistles. It's just like that's the nature of the city's response right now. And while I was boxed in, the first convoy car sped away so that they could lose anybody who might be willing to tail them and observe their actions. And this is all at like 8:30 in the morning on a Wednesday
While kids are being dropped off for school.
while
It's
kids
like
are
school
being
drop
dropped
off.
off.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so the militarization of every public space, including spaces that we used to deem as safe spaces, hospitals, schools, churches, um, is really noteworthy, and it speaks to the very particular brutality that we are experiencing under this administration's occupation.
Imam, what else are you all experiencing? Are you experiencing and seeing? I think you're on mute again.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, I agree with Jack and Reverend Ingrid. So I would say that, it's visible. If you come to South Minneapolis, you would see ice everywhere. I mean, it's for those who don't live here might, you know, think otherwise or might think this is an exaggeration, but if you come to the ground, you actually see that this is real. This is real. And
Yeah.
that's the reason that, like when Renee Good was killed, Minneapolis schools were closed because the streets were not safe. I mean, our neighborhoods, it's not a war zone. We're not, Minneapolis is a very good neighborhood, it's a very safe city. I mean, but when you see ICE agents killing people on the streets, that sends a message that it's like an occupation of the streets and everywhere. So, I mean, it's pretty obvious to everyone, and we hope and we pray that this would come to an end. This chaos would come
Mm.
to an end.
Yeah, it reminds me, people ask me all the time living in DC, do you see the National Guard? And I say to them every day, and they say, what? And I'm like, yeah, there are armed uniformed troops walking by my building every single day when I look out the window. So I know it's hard for people to understand when you're not living in it, so I appreciate you explaining all of that. Um, can I ask Pastor Ingrid? I know for many in the faith community, I've talked to people who are Muslim. Yesterday, especially, was in a conversation with a young Somali American activist in Minneapolis. And she was talking about women who wear hijab and fear for their own safety, being involved with doing like what you're saying, like standing guard for ICE. How are you asking others to show up for not just your Muslim neighbors? I should say we've seen off-duty police officers of color being stopped by ICE. How are you asking people who maybe don't fit that racial profile to show up? As we're hearing Imam Mowlid talk about just how people in the cities are coming together.
Yeah, and just to add, it's really there is not one demographic that is sort of left out of the pickups at this point. Yesterday, on the block of my church, ICE was stopping people doing grocery delivery. So it's the broadness of the pickups is ever expanding too. I think each of us embodies this movement in a different way. And because of unearned privilege as a white woman, I am called to show up in a particular way in this moment. that has meant being arrested at the Minneapolis airport alongside of 97 other faith leaders. It means being public with my words or my presence in the community. I'm very aware that those opportunities are not afforded to all of my colleagues around the community based on color of skin, creed, status. Even those with certain statuses should find themselves really not being able to occupy public spaces right now. And so what we are trying to remind each other is like it's an ecosystem of a movement, and each of us plays a part in that ecosystem. Yeah, ask me another question and I can clarify.
I'm going to ask Jack a question actually, and I see Jack wanting
Yes.
to get in. So Jack, go ahead. Jack,
Just
while you answer that, can you also just
Yep.
talk about like what you saw in LA and Chicago and how that's translating to the ecosystem that Reverend Ingrid is talking about? But go ahead and respond to what she's saying
Yeah,
as well.
and just to echo what I'm hearing from the Reverend, like an interesting thing that's come up in our reporting a lot over the last year is that there is a very public part of the organizing that faith leaders are a part of in terms of like some of the very public witnessing. I was there when Reverend Rasmussen was arrested, and there have been various protests in front of DHS facilities in Chicago. For instance, there was a incident that got a lot of attention of a pastor who was shot in the head with pepper balls. Reverend David Black, he was actually one of several pastors who had that similar experience. But one thing that has been really interesting, and actually when I was in Minneapolis, the pastor of St. Paul's talked to me about how there is a whole nother world of activism that's happening among the vulnerable communities that I'm sure other folks on this own call could talk about as well, that is less public by default, right? It's communities trying to organize for each other, and often in concert with these more public efforts, but trying to protect, as they talk about it, their neighbors as well as their own congregations. And so we saw that in LA, we saw that in Chicago. I spoke to pastors in Chicago where there sometimes would be very like partnerships between the pastors who were very public in terms of what they were doing with their community, and then churches and worshiping communities who were not as public about what they were doing, but were working in partnership with those other communities. And that was fairly common as well. And it seems to have, again, in the sense that these different cities, as there's been an influx of federal agents, have kind of learned from each other, from different faith communities along. It's interesting to kind of see how that has turned out in Minneapolis. Now, I'll add the caveat that I think what's really interesting about Minneapolis is to Reverend Ingrid's point about how it's so ubiquitous, the fact that there's just so many federal agents, and the perspective of the community, at least a lot of folks I talk to, is like, there's a certain point where everyone's at some level of risk. That at some point you do kind of see certain folks become public who otherwise would not want to in terms of their advocacy. And that's everything from, Hispanic churches who were very publicly doing a lot of packing of groceries for those who are afraid to leave their homes, to I did see one person tailing an ICE vehicle in hijab, which I only saw one, and I think that was indicative of the broader concern about not wanting to be as public. But I think that kind of speaks to Minneapolis as in terms of the just ubiquity of the federal presence there and the community collective response. That's really just more like, it's just broader than anything I've seen anywhere else. But I defer to the faith leaders there in terms of what else they've seen.
Is there more that you all wanted to add, Imam, Reverend?
No, I'm
Okay. Jack, can I ask you also, I mean, as we're talking about congregations and the overwhelming support that we are seeing from the faith community to support people in this against this federal operation, there are congregations that have supported ICE, which we saw come to a head in Minneapolis. In your reporting, have you come across faith leaders that are saying they support the Trump administration in this?
Yeah, I mean that is absolutely a thing that exists. I will tell you that they are hard to find in places like Minneapolis, and they are significantly less vocal about that support than the opposition has been. They come from various different corners. Everything from folks who some pastors who are kind of, uncomfortable with what's going on, but still side with law enforcement or the Trump administration as a matter of course, to, some more kind of right-wing pastors who often overlap with overt Christian nationalists. And I use that term in terms of they self-describe as advocates of Christian nationalism, who have been vocally supportive of ICE's efforts. The Pastor Joe Rigney, who's associated with Doug Wilson, who's an Idaho pastor. The church where we recently saw a protest inside the church in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. That protest was protesting a church under allegations that one of the pastors also heads up an ICE field office. I think what's interesting about that is that protest actually made several faith leaders who were critical of ICE uncomfortable. And also, what I've often heard from some of those faith leaders is that, well, while that protest does make me uncomfortable, it does provide me an opportunity to note that the Trump administration actually rescinded a internal policy called the sensitive locations policy that discouraged ICE and DHS from conducting immigration raids at hospitals, schools, and churches. And so there's been frustration from faith leaders, including some who may otherwise be supportive of the Trump administration, of saying, okay, well, our church is really important if you don't want a protester in there, but if a DHS agent needs to go in there, that's different. There's I think I'm paraphrasing one of the pastors I spoke to, saying either houses of worship are sacred or they're not. They're either sanctuaries or they're not. And so even in those moments where we've had churches that are supportive of DHS or ICE, one, again, in Minneapolis, they were far less prevalent than the opposition. And two, there does seem to be this dynamic at play where pastors are also, I don't have to tell the folks on this call. I mean, a lot of churches have seen reduced worship attendance. A lot of mosques have seen the same. One Muslim leader I spoke to said that they'd seen as many as 20% drop in mosque attendance in the Minneapolis area amid all of this. So there's like a lot of concern about whether or not people can even attend worship, and considering that an act of bravery to do so is from what I'm hearing from a lot of the faith leaders.
Mom, can you talk about that? Like what's been happening with Friday prayers for you all? How neighbors in your community have been there as advocates to protect people's ability to worship freely?
Yeah. Well, if I speak about the Friday prayers, I have to appreciate our neighbors. Every Friday sermon, we do have neighbors coming out and protecting the mosque, and they surround the mosque. Every Friday, they come outside if it's cold, if it's not, regardless, they come and they support us. So I want to appreciate and thank all of our neighbors who are standing up with us at this moment. Yes, to Jack's point, there's a drop in the attendance of the mosque worshippers. And that's mainly because of the lack of safety. I mean, most of our congregations are American citizens, and I want to tell to everyone who's tuning in that the people who are afraid are not only like people who don't have documents. These are American citizens who are in their houses, afraid of what they see on the streets. Their parents are saying, "I don't want my child to be killed. I don't want my son or my daughter to be killed. I want them to stay home." And these are American citizens born and raised here in Minneapolis. So yes, there's a decrease the amount of worshipers. And also, like, we do have a weekend school, and that also has been a lot of disruptions in terms of like the continuity of the program because of lack of safety again.
Were you able to meet this past weekend, your weekend school?
No, we have to
No.
cancel everything because of the killing of Alex Preddy, and because we felt a lack of safety. Every time a human being is killed in our streets, that it makes us so. I mean, it's a tragedy, but also it increases that frustration and anger at the same time. The fear that anybody could have been Alex, right? Any one of us. I don't think Alex was expecting to be murdered on a broad daylight on the streets of Minneapolis. So it's the matter is very serious, and we seek God's protection.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There has been, since the killing of Alex Preety across the country and here in Washington, a bipartisan outcry and call for investigation. We're even seeing some Democrats saying they're going to shut down the government instead of voting for an agreement that would have further funded ICE operations. Last night, we did hear President Trump saying that Greg Bovino would be leaving Minneapolis and that he was moving voter czar Tom Homan to be in charge. We heard Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey say last night that federal agents are going to start departing. Can I just first ask you what you all have seen today, and just kind of the basic question, is this enough? Reverend Ingrid, do you want to start?
Sure. What I have seen today is pretty similar dynamics to what we have been experiencing these last weeks. So it doesn't feel like it's a dramatic shift in terms of the street level, the way that this is playing out on the street level.
So you're, just to be clear, you're still seeing everything you described with
Oh,
ICE
yes.
vehicles. Okay, that all happened this morning still.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think what a congregant of mine said when I said on Sunday that I'm waiting for the systemic like the systematic oppression to crack here. A congregant said, Ingrid, I don't think it's going to be one crack, it's going to be 1,000. And so, okay, Bovino leaving, maybe that's a crack. But what we're talking about is so much larger than one person. We are talking about a posture of an administration, a posture of a paramilitary force that is terrorizing a community. And so the departure of one is not going to somehow provide the relief that we're seeking. The other thing I've been thinking about is that I got a text from a friend in another town, not too many hours from here last night, saying, we've been told to expect agents here tomorrow. And I think as leaders of faith, we don't want simply the 3,000 to disperse from Minneapolis and then go 2 by 2 or 300 by 300 to other communities across the country. We want this type of enforcement to end. What we are seeking is an end to the terror that we see playing out on our streets, and the departure of one and the replacement with another is not going to do that.
Imam, would you like to add more to what Reverend Ingrid said?
Yeah, well, I mean, I heard about what the mayor said and the departure of the leader of the ICE, and that makes us a little bit hopeful, but we're not really safe until we see that this whole thing come to an end completely.
I want to make sure we have time for audience questions. I just want to remind folks to use the Q&A portion, not the chat, to put your questions in. I see quite a few of them. And before we get to those, Jack, can I just ask Jack you one more question? Jack, you and I were talking before as we were putting this event together about Maine and about operations that we see ongoing in other parts of the country. Can you just give us a quick sense of, we've been focusing on Minneapolis, we've been talking about maybe the posture of the Trump administration changing, but what are you seeing?
Yeah, I'm working on a story about Maine and what we're seeing out there. Speaking to a faith leader there yesterday, and they were kind of talking about, there's one of the more fascinating elements of all of this is how there is some contextual eccentricities about the different cities in which DHS and ICE land. And Maine is a different is set up differently than Minneapolis. It's a more rural state, and the divide between urban and rural is much easier to come across, right? And so they talked about how they've had difficulty kind of mounting the same level of rapid response that you see in places like Minneapolis. It just takes longer to get out if they hear tale of DHS somewhere to kind of offer the that sort of collective response where people show up with whistles and cell phone cameras. That's harder in certain parts of Maine than it might be in more collectively urban areas. I've also, it's interesting, they were talking about, this faith leader was telling me that a lot of ICE detainees up until the big influx of DHS folks in that state were kind of being held at a county jail, and faith leaders were holding regular convenings and kind of vigils outside of that jail. They were writing letters back and forth, this pastor said, to detainees in the jail. And then when, according to this faith leader, when there was that influx of DHS agents, all of those detainees were removed from that jail overnight, and most of them, they don't know where they went, right? And so that's a different context than you find in, say, Chicago and Minneapolis, where there's a federal building in Minneapolis and the facility in Broadview, Illinois, just outside of Chicago, in that area where there can be kind of sustained protests kind of against ICE among faith leaders who challenge what they're doing. And so it's just a different universe, right? And also, I actually spoke with Reverend Rasmussen about this. There was a lot of community building that has already happened in Minneapolis for a variety of historical reasons in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, for instance, how communities have really kind of come together and forged a bunch of organizing efforts that don't necessarily exist in other parts of the country. And so I think that has painted a lot of things we're seeing in other places as well. I say all that noting that one thing that remains fascinating to me as a reporter is how quickly faith leaders are leaning on each other to learn some of the ways that they're approaching pushing back against ICE. Just as a raw practical reality, talking to folks in Charlotte, for instance, who when there was a border patrol influx there of people coming from Chicago, within 48 hours of those agents landing, there were hundreds of people in churches for ICE Watch trainings. And I should note that those trainings were actually set up months in advance because they were planning them ahead of an influx of funds passed by Congress into DHS and expected them to show up in Charlotte eventually. So it just so happened that it arrived at the same time. I see that all across the country. So there's a lot of differences in terms of how different communities are responding, but the common thread is that I'm seeing faith leaders from across the religious spectrum collectively organizing in a way that I haven't seen. And as the faith leader told me yesterday, they said, this is not what I was trained to do, but it's what I feel called to do in this moment because of my faith anyway. So I'm hearing versions of that answer in cities across the country over and over again.
Thanks for that, Jack. Let's get to some of the audience questions, including this first one from Heidi, who's asking, in terms of a response from faith leaders, is a diversity of religions represented? Is there anyone conspicuous by their absence? Reverend Ingrid, it sounds like you're saying yes and no. Is that right?
I mean, Imam, help me here too. I think there's absolutely a diversity of religions represented. This is an interfaith movement, and we have interfaith organizing institutions and organizations that have helped us to create that. Is anybody noticeably absent? I would say no. Nobody that I'm surprised is not at the table.
We're getting a lot of questions. Oh, Imam, did you want to add something to that? Go ahead.
Can I add one thing? Yeah, well, I would say that I think the presence of the faith leaders in this whole crisis is conspicuous. That's what I would say.
It's conspicuous. Okay. Yeah. Not inconspicuous. Thank you. Jack?
And just one quick thing as like a top line dynamic. Two things are true at the same time. It is both very true and obvious that one major religious constituency, conservative evangelical Protestants, are not super represented in these pushback efforts. That's just a fact of my reporting. And also, I have found some of those doing this work as well. When I was in Chicago riding around with these two high schoolers who were searching for ICE, trying to observe, or operate as observers, they come from a theologically conservative family,
Mhm.
and the family is rooted in this very conservative Christian denomination. Their father is a professor at Wheaton College, which is a conservative Christian evangelical school. So, and then even there were students from Wheaton who even held a vigil outside of that Broadview DHS facility in Illinois. So while it is true that you're not seeing a ton of evangelical Protestants in particular, conservative evangelicals outside or DHS facilities or part of these protests, I have seen them as well.
Can I ask all of you, we're getting a lot of questions around practical strategies, but also just how to talk about this. I saw a question about how purple congregations can talk about this. We got an email before the event from a woman named Susan who said, we're struggling how to tell the story in a way that is not partisan. And we would welcome any tips. Imam, Reverend, can you share how you discuss this in a way that how maybe I imagine you should frame it in more religious or faith-based terms versus political?
Yeah, so what I would say is that so I'll give you a practical example. I was invited to give a speech at Lutheran Church in St. Paul, and I didn't know anyone in the audience. That was the first time I came into that congregation. So I spoke in a way that resonated with everyone because I spoke about safety and justice,
Mhm.
and I spoke about that everybody deserves peace. So that was my message to everyone. And I think as faith leaders, we're not speaking as Republicans or Democrats. We're speaking we're speaking from a human rights perspectives. So every time I give a speech, I would say this is not a political statement. This is a basic human rights. So I think one of the way to speak about as faith leaders is to give a unifying message that we're united and that every human being has the same dignity, the same protection. We're all created by God, and we're worth of respect and protection. And one of the things I said was that no human being his dignity should be stripped away because of a lack of documents. Because our dignity doesn't come through documents; it comes because we're created from, because of our Creator. That's why we are dignified, beings. So something like that. Through that lines, I was able to convey my message.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think I'd say that it's impossible for truth to not be politicized in this moment. So if we're trying to thread a needle, I don't think the needle is there when it comes to truth and politics right now. But I will say that one of the most powerful things that we can do is uh, ground these stories in our own realities. So, for instance, I grew up on a family farm in a small town. I now serve in the center of the city, occupying an office that is calling me to do things that I never imagined for myself. And I think what we can say is that, or what I can say to my neighbors is that I wouldn't want this treatment of my neighbors in small town Minnesota. I certainly don't want this treatment of my neighbors in the center of Minneapolis. And this is really a conversation for Christians, I'll speak for myself, for me as a Christian, this is about the kind of neighbors that we want to be. And we don't, the congregation that I serve is saying, we don't want the forces of domination to shape who we are. We want love, mercy, wisdom, understanding, vulnerability to shape who we are in this world. And so I think whatever we can do to ground our commitments in our own stories is what actually, in the end, moves communities to action.
On a related note, we got a question from Jennifer who says, I would love to hear more about Reverend Ingrid's conversations with her congregation about how they preserve rituals while being attentive to the fact that they are in moral crisis. In a sense, the church is in the streets. The Hebrew for worship means to serve. How have these conversations gone, and what does it take to shift in these times? Can I add just another one on there? Because Imam Mowlid, I wanted to ask you about Ramadan approaching, Reverend Ingrid, as we think about Lent approaching. I wonder how you're framing all of that.
I would say that worship has always been a central part of who we are as a congregation, and that continues to be a grounding force. So, and that was true after the murder of George Floyd and the fires that surrounded our congregation as well. Much of our neighborhood was burned to the ground. So this is not the first really significant moral crisis that we've lived through, and we're recalling lessons from the past too. That worship is really central to who we are, and we have to keep showing up for one another in that space. This is affecting our kids really deeply. Our kids are being led through ICE drills. Their classmates are no longer, their classmates are no longer going to school, or some of our kids are staying home because they're afraid to go out, or their parents are. And I think whatever we can do to sort of keep those rhythms for our kids going, that has been important to us as well. Really, the rest of it maybe is kind of that adiaphora that we say at this moment in time. We are called to something more, and we are called to that sort of deep allyship, that deep accompaniment of one another, the mutual aid that passes all understanding. And whatever that is calling out of us is what we're prioritizing in this moment. And, my congregation, they understand, and they trust that when somebody dies, or when somebody enters hospice, or when somebody's relationship comes to an end, that I will still be there for them, and that we will as a community. So I think it's not one or the other. It's about how we learn to hold more things together.
Imam.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. One thing I would say is Ramadan is approaching. Ramadan is a special month for us as Muslims, and we're actually organizing a big appreciation event. We're inviting all the church congregations, neighbors, and everyone to just share the meal with them, because they stood with us in this difficult moment. So we're organizing that appreciation event, but at the same time, we're concerned about if ICE continues to do what it's doing right now, we might not be able to go to the mosque and worship freely. So we're hoping that before Ramadan, that this whole crisis and this chaos will come to an end. So it's a big concern that if these things continue the way it is, we might not be able to conduct the usual activities that we normally have during the month of Ramadan. Yeah.
Thank you both for sharing that. Jack, we have a question for you. For reporters across the country, also covering faith groups and leaders at the intersection of defending immigrant rights against ICE, what stories do you still think need to be told? What questions still need to be asked? What should we be wary of?
Yeah, I think one of those things I hinted at earlier, there's a certain story that, for obvious reasons, is very difficult to get, which is that organizing that's happening underneath all of this public organizing, and how communities that are vulnerable are organizing for each other. I think for a lot of reasons, that's a difficult story to be able to tell publicly. And so I would definitely want more information about that. I also think that the internal similarly, the internal conversations that are happening within worshiping communities about this, I think is also a harder conversation to get, and story to kind of get, but one I also think would be very interesting. We get snippets of it in different kinds of reporting, but we don't necessarily know how that looks like at like a session meeting, for instance. And so I think that's an interesting one. And then I do think too, one of the things that's been super fascinating for me and many of my RNS colleagues and again, particularly Aleha Hertzler McCain, my colleague, is that like there's just this kind of moving target of how many different things faith communities are a part of, right? So like we hear about, there's these immigration court situations where people are, where immigrants are going to immigration court and then leaving in DHS custody. It turns out that there are faith leaders that are now accompanying them. That's a very common practice across the country of faith leaders and even bishops, including Catholic bishops, who go and either observe court or actively escort people to immigration court or to to check-ins with ICE, right? And the fact that so many communities now are helping pack groceries and supplies for families that are afraid to leave their home. I drove around with one volunteer who was part of a church community who was serving this one particular immigrant family, a woman whose husband was detained and then deported, and she is pregnant with 2 children and has been diagnosed with cancer, all within the same month. And so how they're trying to respond to that, and that's immediate response to these sorts of folks, and those are more common stories than you would think, and they're happening at a pretty rapid clip. But they don't necessarily make the same levels, the same headlines. So I think those are things to keep an eye on, because the reality is that the immigration apparatus in this country is very vast and it has lots of different dimensions. And I keep trying to find a place where there aren't faith communities involved at some level, and it's just really hard to find. There's just a religious response across the board there. So I think, if anything, I wouldn't even begin to tell you where to look, because I say look everywhere. Like if there's a piece of the immigration apparatus, you will see a religious response. In fact, I'll close on this, which is that when Kilmar Abrego Garcia went back for another check-in, what got a lot of coverage is that he did not leave, right? He left. He was taken back into custody at that check-in 2 or 3 months ago. But what got less coverage was that what happened before that was a massive group of faith leaders that were surrounding him and praying for him, and that he prayed before he walked in. And the faith leaders went as far as officials would let them go, and that he huddled with supporters and family and prayed before he walked in as well. That element of trying to walk with immigrants that these faith communities view as their own neighbors who are in crisis is constant, and the stories are basically endless at this point.
I think we have time for one more question. So I'm just going to ask, I know this is a big question, if you can answer it briefly, but Odette wants to know, what are the different ways faith communities can daily show up for you from different locations?
Well, I think the best way is just, show up. Just Google the nearest mosque and just, say that, hey, I'm here. We had like last Friday, I saw a couple of ladies. They came and I asked, like, how did you find out? And they said, we all just Googled the nearest mosque, and then that's how we came. So I want to say to everyone who tuned in today, whether you live in Minnesota or outside of Minnesota, just reach out to your neighbors. This is not only Minnesota. I think we as faith leaders in Minnesota, we want to set a good example to the nation, right? That, fear and division, fear doesn't have to win. Division doesn't have to win. There are people who want to divide us, but we're united. So we want to spread that unity and that love and mercy to the entire nation. And every one of us, we have a role to play in that. Yeah.
Thank you, Imam.
I have nothing to add to that. I think that is the answer. I think it is the connections built between people, and whether that's here or whether it's elsewhere, that is what I have been thinking about, like how we build our muscles of love and mercy and compassion and justice. And we need those muscles to be built in Minneapolis and across the country and across the world. So I agree with the Imam that find your people, find them, and nurture those relationships.
Well, thank you. Thanks to everyone for these amazing questions. I want to thank our faith leaders, particularly Jack as well. for taking time out of everyone's very busy lives for an hour for us to be present in this moment with each other. Imam Ali, Reverend Rasmussen, Jack Jenkins, thank you. I also want to thank the Luce Foundation for their support of our immigration reporting. And if you enjoyed this event, a preview of next month, we're going to be hosting a live behind the scenes conversation with our reporters on February 24th at 12 noon Eastern Time. They're going to be talking about the stories that if you can believe it, we're not at the end of the month of the first year. So we're going to be talking about all of that. That conversation is going to be offered as a thank you to readers who choose to support RNS. We are a nonprofit independent news source. If you would like to join us, a donation today will preserve your place. We will share details on how to join shortly after you make a gift. And to stay informed about RNS, we are on every social channel, from Blue Sky to TikTok to Instagram. We're on your email if you don't want to connect with us on social media. And we'll put that link to sign up for our morning newsletter one more time in the chat. But thank you. Thank you for listening, reading, sharing, and all the support of our journalism here at RNS. Everyone, please stay safe. Thanks so much.
Thank you.